Why the Chiefs lost. Someone used a voodoo doll against them at the Super Bowl. This whole thing is crazy, and suddenly, Mahomes wasn't himself. He looked off the entire time. The Chiefs weren't playing like the team we know. Mahomes has never been swept before, until now. I felt it while watching. I'm not even a Chiefs fan. I was rooting for the Eagles, but something about Mahomes' energy was just wrong. He was missing plays he normally wouldn't, making mistakes that felt unnatural. Why is Mahomes playing like this? The whole team feels off, but especially Mahomes. At first I thought I was overreacting, but then, this morning, I see it all over Twitter. A woman in the stadium holding a voodoo doll during the game, and suddenly, it all clicked. Now, I know not everyone believes in this stuff, but let's be real. This is New Orleans, one of the most infamous cities for voodoo and dark rituals. Coincidence? Maybe. But with everything that happened in that game, I don't think so. So now I have questions. Who is this woman? Did she actually curse Mahomes?
I lived in New Orleans for 23 years of my life, like 23 of them things. And let me tell you, what old girl was doing in the stands to Patrick Mahomes is as real as it gets. She was really sitting there with a voodoo doll poking at Patrick Mahomes, and he had a horrible game. Horrible. So much that people are calling him washed. The witchcraft in New Orleans is, I'm telling y'all, when you cross over into New Orleans atmosphere, the darkness is so powerful. You feel the darkness. I've been telling people this for years. If you go down to the French
history books, come here, let me stretch y'all out right fast, because this New Orleans hood history on one of the most popular haunted houses in New Orleans, the Buckner Mansion. Now, the Buckner Mansion was built by Henry S. Buckner. They call him a cotton kingpin. You know what that means. And still to this day, it's said to be haunted by his housekeeper, Josephine, who died in the house. The Buckner Mansion is over 20,000 square feet, and it's only that big because Henry Buckner wanted to compete with his own boy who had built a house in Natchez, Mississippi. In 1923, a dude named George Soleil moved his business school into the Buckner Mansion, and it stayed there until 1983. The Buckner Mansion probably always been haunted, but it didn't get popular until after American Horror Story started filming their show in there. The Buckner Mansion is located in the Garden District, so
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chakras and Cusswords podcast. My name is Catherine, and I am your host. And today we're going to talk about all things voodoo, voodoo, and all things a little bit magical and have really kind of been coming out in the media. And a lot of this has to do with Patrick Mahomes. So during the Super Bowl, Patrick Mahomes was seen getting hexed. Okay, let's get into this. So a lot of people are speculating that Patrick Mahomes was hexed, and that is the reason why he played like shit. So during the Super Bowl that aired on February 9th of 2025, a Philadelphia Eagles fan was captured on video using a voodoo doll resembling Kansas City quarterback Patrick Mahomes. She had like this little doll. It was so small. It was so cute. It was like the cutest, smallest little voodoo doll I've ever seen. You could tell she was just able to put it in her purse and take it in there with her. The woman was dressed in an Eagles green, and she basically was stabbing this doll like crazy. Like when I saw her stabbing this doll, I was like, oh my goodness, girlfriend is not fucking around. Like she did not come to play. Like she wanted to hex him. And also she was using like a lot of kinetic energies, which makes me think that she definitely put some of her intentions, alignment was definitely there, because you could see her poking that voodoo doll and rocking back and forth. And a lot of people thought that she was like chanting or she was saying something, but you could definitely see that there was a lot of movement, there was a lot of intention, there was a lot of energy really kind of working this up. And we all know that Patrick Mahomes is very talented. He has an amazing career, but for whatever reason, he just played horribly this Super Bowl. So this video quickly went viral, and it sparked a range of reactions online. Like people were like, what is going on? I will be honest, the first time I saw this video, I was like, who is this white lady? And no shade to the white voodoo practitioners, but voodoo originated in New Orleans with African Americans who were enslaved. So I was like, who is this white lady? Okay. But you know what, honey, she threw some I guess you could say some energy towards Patrick Mahomes, right? And while some people say that this was very inappropriate, that she should not have been hexing him, she should not have had a voodoo doll, a lot of people think it's actually humorous. And some people actually feel that it was justified because she was in New Orleans, and New Orleans is basically the area of where voodoo was created. In all honesty, voodoo is kind of like a mixture of cultures. So this incident has definitely had a lot of people conversating about voodoo and conversating about, could this actually have taken place? Could she actually have hexed him? And yeah, of course she could actually have hexed him, right? She's in there, she's in the stadium with other Eagles fans, and they got the energy going and all this negativity's going, and maybe Patrick Mahomes was just playing bad. Maybe he was just letting it get to him. But a lot of people believe that this voodoo doll lady, or as some might say, the Super Bowl witch, really knew what she was doing, because she did actually create him to play horribly, is what a lot of people are thinking. And I'll be honest, I mean, voodoo is a practice that is tied very deep into the ancient lands of New Orleans. And New Orleans has a deep and fascinating history with voodoo, blending African spiritual traditions with Catholicism and also with the French Creole culture. Voodoo arrived in Louisiana during the transatlantic slave trade, and primarily through having enslaved Africans who were transported from Africa to basically become slaves, right? And they were usually transported from West Africa. So this area of West Africa has a lot of culture with Yoruba, Fon, and also the Congo people, who have a lot of traditions that were very similar to voodoo practices. These spiritual practices, so then with the enslaved people of Louisiana, then kind of like mixed some of the cultures, right? They then kind of like mixed French and Spanish Catholic influence, creating this New Orleans voodoo. And it's very unique, and it's very much founded in that area of taking the ancient African practices and also a lot of the ancient Haitian practices and mixing it together with its own kind of like formula, its own center of magic. And voodoo has been popular for a while, especially in the 1700s, where Africans and enslaved African Americans at the time had to basically use it because they had no religion. They had no spiritual energy allowed to them. So a lot of times the enslaved Africans brought their own spiritual beliefs. They were trying to keep that connection to their heritage, including their ancestral worship and their area of creating energy. So a lot of times they would practice it like in drumming. They would do a lot of drumming and ritual dances. So they were able to kind of like merge this new spiritual practice. Also, what's interesting about this is a lot of them used Catholic saints kind of, and also kind of like intertwined it with like orishas and other religious figures from their homelands and also from their energies of stories. So I definitely would say that voodoo, especially voodoo from New Orleans, has a lot of like symbolism that kind of reminds me of some of the Catholic saints. Like sometimes when I look at their deities, I'm not sure if it is a Catholic saint or if it is a deity from a voodoo practice, or kind of mixed in with some other type of religious practice or some other type of ritual. The Catholic practice of praying to saints aligned quite nicely with the African traditions of honoring spirits. So the African traditions were, and also the Haitian traditions, were more centered around paying homage to certain spirits and paying homage to certain areas of gods and certain areas of honoring the spirit. There was also a big Haitian influence. So in the 1790s to the 1800s, the Haitian Revolution occurred, and this led to thousands of Haitian refugees, both a combination of people who were free and also people who were enslaved, arriving to New Orleans. Many of these people began to practice a lot of Haitian voodoo. So we have to remember that these spiritual traditions are very common in their homeland, which they wanted to bring this representation of them, of their homeland, into their practices of where they were now, right? And a lot of these energies and a lot of these practices were usually condemned by the white people, condemned by the slave owners, to keep the majority of these people oppressed, to keep them more oppressed, to keep them controlled, and to not allow them to have any religious and spiritual practices. So many people had to go like underground. They had to share their spiritual beliefs kind of underground. It wasn't really something that they honored like in big practices outside, because they received a lot of backlash, and also because they were slaves, so they weren't allowed that freedom. They weren't allowed that area of spiritual presence. So we have to remember that there was a lot of area that it was almost like seen hidden. And I think that's sometimes how a lot of people who are just very, I guess you could say, just not very aware of what has occurred, continue to label voodoo as black magic, or as something that is seen as a art or a religion practice that is seen as bad or seen as evil. But there's also been a lot of pop culture that kind of began to talk about voodoo and also kind of put it in a not so great light. But one of the people who really stands out to me when I think about voodoo practitioners and people who are popular in the area of voodoo practitioner is Marie Laveau. So she was known as the voodoo queen. She was almost like, if voodoo had a high priestess, she was definitely the high priestess. So Marie Laveau was a legendary figure and perhaps one of the most famous New Orleans voodoo practitioner. So she was Creole woman. She kind of, she looked like she was mixed, biracial, and she basically blended voodoo with Catholic practices and also folk magic. So she became a very powerful spiritual leader, and she was known to having like charms, amulets. She was known for healing people. So a lot of people went to her for healing practices if they were sick, if something was going wrong with them. So she had a huge influence, not only with the African Americans in Louisiana, but also with the Caucasian communities as well. So she was definitely somebody who was highlighted as a voodoo queen or even as a high priestess, but she definitely had a lot of influence, and she still has a lot of influence on a lot of the modern day practitioners and also a lot of the modern day mystics.
Let's talk about Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans. Y'all see what I did there? Now, if you're from New Orleans, if you've watched American Horror Story, or if you just know your history, you would know exactly who this Black Queen was. But if you don't, I'm here to enlighten you. She was many things. A dedicated practitioner of voodoo, a healer, an herbalist, an entrepreneur, a prominent female religious leader and activist, and she also did root work and would conjure Native American and African spiritualism, as well as Louisiana voodoo and traditional Roman Catholicism. She was Catholic. And she also owned a beauty salon. Now, if you watched American Horror Story, the Coven season, Angela Bassett played her, and she did an excellent job. You would see how she basically owned the salon on the show, basically as her cover-up job. But really, she was much more than just a hairstylist, y'all. But she took on many wealthy clients, and I felt like that's really how she got her word out there too, and her clientele by, people coming into her hair salon. And even though people already knew her, but she would get many wealthy clients to come to her hair salon. And there are still descendants of Marie Laveau living today. And they're extremely proud of their heritage, and they educate and enlighten and still teach to this day. But people would literally travel from all over. I'm talking about wealthy people would travel all over for the help of Marie Laveau. They would come to her.
A lot of fans and a lot of modern mystics felt like the way that they portrayed her in that show was just not justified. Because in all honesty, she was seen as somebody who had a lot of healing properties, a lot of spiritual influence, more on an area of well-being versus an area that was centered around constant hexing and constant influence of Bane magic. In the 19th century, the rise of voodoo kind of took place. So voodoo ceremonies became more public, and it often happened in the Congo Square, where enslaved people gathered on Sundays to practice music, dance, and spiritual rituals. The elite class, so the white people, probably the slave owners, they attempted to suppress voodoo, and they actually saw it as very rebellious and a lot of area where they didn't like the slaves having freedom, and they wanted to basically stop it. They didn't like it. So unfortunately, a lot of people had to go underground with their spiritual practices. And despite this, voodoo then thrived underground. And I think that's why a lot of people still associate voodoo as being something as very dark, as being something as very evil or sinister. But in all honesty, voodoo has many elements to it. It has many areas where it emerges different cultures, different intentions, different practices, different areas of influences, and it emerges it together. But voodoo going underground kind of create this energy of secret rituals, and it kind of made this area where people were then selling voodoo things and creating voodoo potions, voodoo amulets, and it was seen as something that was forbidden, something that was hidden, and it kind of made it a little bit more, as some people would say, scary. So during the 20th century, the commercialization and the pop culture of voodoo kind of began to dibble and dabble. By the early 1900s, voodoo became sensationalized and often portrayed in movies and in media as dark, mystical, and associated with curses. So a lot of times, if you ever thought you were getting cursed, you probably thought it was from a voodoo practitioner, or the energy of people coming alive from the dead. I don't know why they had zombies with voodoo, but pop culture, they love to make everything feel a little bit more, I don't know, just weird. But voodoo shops began to appear in the French Quarter, selling spiritual items like grease bags, candles, and charms. Also, tourists became fascinated with Marie Laveau's tomb, where visitors would often leave her offerings and often decorate her tomb. So voodoo today has kind of changed a little bit. New Orleans voodoo is still practiced today, even though it has evolved and became a little bit more seen as an art, seen as a religious practice. There's still that area where people are thinking like, oh no, did this lady really get a voodoo doll? And hex, Patrick Mahomes, was that the reason why he played so horrible? No, he probably just played horrible because he was having a horrible day. Who knows? It is often intertwined with hoodoo. So voodoo and hoodoo are a little bit different, but a lot of times you'll hear of both of them. So hoodoo tends to kind of come more from the African American folk magic, where voodoo is a mix, and it was definitely more originated with the area of West Africa and also Haitian practices, and it kind of emerged into the energy of what is voodoo today in Louisiana. So Louisiana actually hosts a lot of voodoo ceremonies, festivals, and they even have a voodoo museum where people can go and learn more about voodoo. So we have to remember that voodoo has a lot of modern practitioners that work as spiritual healers. They work as the energy of root workers. They root as that energy of being tied into the energy of allowing and also helping others. So some of the famous voodoo landmarks, if you ever go to New Orleans, you could check out Marie Laveau's tomb. It's at the St. Louis Cemetery, and it is number 1. Visitors often, like I said, leave her flowers, leave her offerings, so that's something you could check out. The Congo Square, which is a historic site of African spiritual gatherings, and the Voodoo Museum, which is known to preserve the history of ancient traditions of voodoo in New Orleans. And then there's also tons of voodoo shops that you could check out, like all around the downtown area, and also these shops will sell traditional charms and often sometimes offer some type of reading or energy clearing. So New Orleans voodoo is deeply rooted in the energy of community and spirituality, far beyond the Hollywood myths and far beyond the traditional energy of people seeing it as something spooky, right? And voodoo is focused on creating that area of representation for the culture of the ancestors and also for the spirits and having that sacred balance with nature. So the history of voodoo dolls, and this is what we all were like, ooh, is that a voodoo doll of Patrick Mahomes? So the history of voodoo dolls is complex and is often misunderstood, largely due to the Hollywood myths and sensationalization and portrayals that voodoo has. So while voodoo dolls are commonly associated with Louisiana voodoo, Haitian voodoo, and West African spiritual traditions, their origins and uses are more centered around the stereotypical sticking the pins and it's cursing somebody. But we can remember, we could curse people without a voodoo doll, right? You could curse somebody. A lot of people could curse some people with their words. So the origins of voodoo dolls traces back to the roots of West African religious traditions and European folklore. So voodoo dolls technically have also been centered around in European folk magic. So it's very similar to puppet or like puppet magic, or using other types of, I guess you could say, things or material objects to create some type of existence. So it has transitioned into other cultures. And some of these cultures include Egypt, Greece, and European witchcraft. So it is seen where a lot of practitioners will use objects to create some type of intention. So the West African spirituality, known as pre-voodoo times, I guess you could say, is in West African voodoo, which is when they would use the small figurines or objects were used to connect with the spirits or the orishas or the ancestors. These objects were not made to create harm, but used as energies of blessings, protection, healing, and guidance. Priests and healers might create these areas of personal items receiving energy or to be centered around certain spirits being called to, or certain spirits to receive some type of energy. And a lot of this had to do with the areas of intervention. Then we also have to remember that the Haitian voodoo and the area of traditions around the 1700s from the areas of the Caribbean and Americans kind of had a different type of focus. So due to this, it forced a lot of Christian conversions. Many African spiritual practices merged from the Catholics. And the Haitian voodoo incorporated European folk magic concepts, including the use of dolls in spiritual work. So this is why sometimes people will give us like a rosary, or they'll give us like a card that will represent some type of religious practice, because it's brought to bring some type of energy to this object. These were often used with like healing, luck, love, and justice, rather than cursing or creating harm. So the Louisiana voodoo and the emergence of the voodoo doll really didn't actually take place till about the 1800s, as voodoo evolved in New Orleans and the use of dolls became a mix of African, Caribbean, and French folk magic traditions. And the enslaved people and free Creoles at the time, because a lot of them practiced root work and conjuring sometimes, often used dolls and also as spiritual focus. So sometimes they would use dolls as spiritual focus, or the energy of like, I don't know if any of you have heard of the spirit box, but the spirit box would be sometimes like something that would have an object where people will be able to ask the box or get messages through that energy. So it technically isn't always set out to create some type of curse, but does it happen? Yeah, sure. So the dolls were commonly used as centers to create areas of intentions, and also sometimes as the energy of protection. So it's definitely interesting, right? So Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen, was said to use dolls, but for blessings and petitions, not necessarily for curses. So I honestly think that Hollywood was the one who really created the whole voodoo doll persona. I don't necessarily think that it's actually from the national or from the traditional traditions of voodoo, because it seems like it was more centered around Hollywood. Early Hollywood films sensationalized the media of distorted voodoo dolls, and they love to use it in revenge magic or black magic or bane magic. And the idea of sticking the dolls with pins was something that Hollywood came up with. It's not a true actual voodoo practice. So the reality of dolls in voodoo and hoodoo and root work is often more centered around love, healing, and protection, or sometimes spiritual guidance. So the voodoo dolls, in some ways, are kind of like something that was created by Hollywood, because that's what Hollywood does. They love to take religious practices, especially religious practices from Black and brown people, and they love to make it like demonized. They love to turn it into something that it isn't, just like with witches, or that center around alchemy, or the center around energy work. They love to change it. So today, voodoo dolls are used in New Orleans and also in hoodoo and folk magic traditions for various purposes. that's not always for cursing somebody. We have to remember that not everybody is centered around cursing somebody all the time. So a lot of times people can use these voodoo dolls for love and attraction. The dolls can be used to invoke energies of passion, healing, and protection. And the dolls are sometimes blessed to place areas of symbolism in homes, the energy of protecting the home, justice and karma. Sometimes they use these dolls to petition spirits to bring justice, and often it is seen as cursing. So I want to talk about this because there's two different things. So when you are doing like Bane magic would be like basically you are creating some type of magic that comes from no area of goodwill or no area of something occurring. So if somebody has directly put harm on you or directly put harm on your loved ones or something like that, a lot of times people will create an energy for justification, an energy for justice. And to do this is different than Bane magic. So Bane magic is basically you're like jealous of this person, you hate them, but you never was given a reason why. So you might do a curse on them, you might do some type of hex on them because you are jealous of them, because you're upset they took your boyfriend away, who knows, right? But for whatever reason, it's not justified. So that is not something for justice, right? Something from justice would be if somebody literally hurt you, betrayed you, hurt your family, something like that. So yes, a lot of witches, energy workers, root workers, voodoo practitioners, spiritualists, modern mystics will do areas of petitions, areas of creating for justice. And that's not necessarily Bane magic. So it's interesting, but there is a difference. So if it's not coming from any goodwill, if it's not coming from energies of justice, then you are just creating a hex because of your own insecurities, which witches and modern mystics shouldn't do. So, I mean, that's my personal opinion. And to me, there's always certain people that are always off limits, right? I know a lot of people love to create spells just to create spells, love to do witchcraft just to do witchcraft. But I mean, in all honesty, like kids are automatically off limits. You would never create anything towards anybody else's kids. Animals definitely off limits. Me personally, coworkers. Coworkers are off limits, right? I don't have any ties to them, I don't believe in creating a domination spell against my boss. Would I feel good doing it? Maybe for a little bit, but why? That energy of karma, I believe, will come back later. The energy of something like that. So there's certain people you just don't create energies around, intention or energy around. So I think if it's revengeful, where it's not centered around justice, then it is considered Bane magic. That's my personal opinion, but everybody to each its own. So manifesting and luck. A lot of people will use the voodoo doll for manifesting and luck. For instance, almost like a energy absorbent where they're placing a written wish, or they're placing some type of energy into the doll for more creation. So the real history of voodoo dolls and the area of hoodoo and voodoo comes from a lot of area that almost has a negative focus. And I think that people need to stop being so centered around the negativity of these spiritual practices and see the energy of well-being with a lot of these spiritual practices, and especially a lot of spiritual practices that come from ancestral traditions that were rooted way before the energy of churches and the energy of influence from other populations and other communities, because a lot of people want to get back to their traditional roots and also to their area of traditions, focus from their ancestors and certain lineages. So I think it was very interesting that this lady was out there hexing or poking the shit out of a voodoo doll that looked like Patrick Mahomes. Do I think it created some magic? Possibly. Do I think it created magic just from her? Absolutely not. I think it was a collective of things. I think it was, she was in a spiritual land. She was in a very spiritual land. She was also in a very kind of focused group. She was in a collective that was very focused on Patrick Mahomes playing like crap. And there was a lot of prayer that was taking place. Everybody was chanting. Everybody was praying for him to have the ultimate demise of a horrible Super Bowl performance. And guess what? Their energy alone manifested that. And he had one of the worst games of his career. So sad for Patrick Mahomes. So happy for the Eagle fans. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about this New Orleans voodoo lady? And do you think she actually had an influence on Patrick Mahomes' performance? Also, let me know what you think about voodoo. Do you think voodoo is a practice or a spiritual practice you would be interested in learning more about? Do you feel like, no, you are centered around different spiritual practices? Also, we have to remember that all magic comes from folk magic, right? So the center of learning from the ancients, learning from the wisdom of history. And I wanted to share this podcast with you to kind of clear the air of this horrible story of this poor lady who probably is like scared to come forward because people are probably now trying to curse her. So everybody have an amazing day, and please comment, like, share, and share this with your witchy bestie. Bye.